All right, hello, welcome everybody. This is the Kubernetes SIG Architecture Community Meeting for November 5th, 2020. Please all remember that this is a recorded meeting that will be preserved on YouTube, so please treat each other with respect, follow our code of conduct, and happy to have you all here. I'm hoping to have a good, interesting discussion today. Let me display the agenda here. Okay. All right. Last meeting, we Tim Allclair brought to the meeting a document, an agenda item around the discussion around possibly some sort of access control metadata, whether that's labels or something else. We unfortunately, none of us were prepared to discuss it at the time, so we put it on the agenda for this meeting, and I sent out a mail an hour and a half or so ago. Sorry, it was not 2 days ago, but to remind folks, hopefully people have had a chance to review that and start the discussion. Tim, I see you're on, so if you want to provide any additional context, or we can jump in with what people think here.
Sure. So a reminder of how this got kind of bubbled up to SIG architecture. This came up as part of a discussion around network policy. And the desire is to be able to securely bind network policies to namespaces in the case when users of those namespaces are granted permission to edit the labels on the namespaces, but we still want to restrict them by the network policy. So there's sort of there's a path forward for network policy in this specific case of enumerating the namespace names explicitly and moving away from labels. But this the same theme comes up pretty frequently with regards to other policy enforcement mechanisms, especially when there's desire for any sort of sub-namespace level controls. So that's kind of the context for talking about this, and sort of around secure, I would call it like secure policy binding or enforcement. There's kind of another discussion that came out of this discussion, or another I guess use case that came out of this discussion around a resource hierarchy, and so or kind of policy. It's related to policy delegation, but if I want to have something that say a policy that applies to a deployment, how can I kind of propagate that policy down to the pods that are ultimately created for that deployment? Or a policy at the namespace level, like it's propagated down to things within that namespace. That one's a little more clear. And so that's kind of related to some of the discussion around inheriting tags and inheriting various features as well.
All right, well, thanks, Tim. I guess what we can do maybe is take a look here at the document that Tim and Garlene put together. So here you're talking about prior and current proposals, I guess. Metadata policy, protected attributes, and then tags, which Brian proposed, I think, in the mailing list. Is Brian on? I don't see him in the list. Okay. I was curious about, one of the things I was curious about with tags, so we're talking about So with the others, I mean, it sounds like nobody's particularly looking for metadata policy anymore. Like that was, you're sort of mentioning it for completeness, but I didn't hear anybody arguing for it. Protected attributes, I mean, these are my opinions. My summary is protected attributes sounds pretty, pretty powerful, but pretty complex, pretty difficult to implement, or really not so much that, but pretty unnecessary to implement within our core infrastructure, because we can already do this with Gatekeeper or with OPA or with other admission controllers. So it wasn't clear to me that there was a specific need for that anymore. And tags, the thing about tags that I thought was different, characterized it differently than the others, was it was creating a separate resource that could be RBAC'd using our standard RBAC. What wasn't clear to me is, do we still expect we would put similar controls on per key type of constraints that you would see out of like using Gatekeeper or OPA or something, or I mean, I guess there's nothing to stop you from doing that, but just I'm trying to understand the proposal a little bit better if anybody is familiar with it. I guess without Brian here, maybe nobody.
I saw some comments about it being a separate resource, but then it wasn't clear that that was what everyone was expecting. Like if it's a new type of metadata, in some cases it could be loosely coupled, but in other cases you would expect it to be associated with the object. So I saw sort of pros and cons discussed in the thread on that. The main difference seemed to be who was expected to set it, rather than whether it was stored with the object or not.
Yes, but I guess yes, right. It's more the implementation detail about how you manage the separate set of RBAC rules that would apply to this particular.
My recollection of that thread, which might be faulty because I didn't go reread it, but if I recalled, people wanted to set it separately, but it was a totally open question whether it would be best to optimize things by also like actually literally storing it with all the objects. So yeah, I think it was
the thing that I saw mentioned was being set at creation time in order to inherit tags. So if you want to set it at creation time, then I don't see how you make it a separate resource or a sub resource with like 2 calls, one of which could fail.
I think the idea was like you define these things separately, and then when an object is created, like it looks for matching tags and then applies them at creation time.
Which gets into raciness and other things that we've tried to remove from other parts of the system.
Yeah, I don't think if you're creating your tag and your object at exactly the same time, I think you probably shouldn't do that.
I mean, I bet you every application in the world that wanted to use tags would have a YAML file with their resources in the tag, and it's going to be racy. It was interesting too, because like one of the things I was thinking here is like the spectrum of choices is orthogonality to existing systems. Like tags is like, let's invent a new concept, yay! And then the first ones are a little bit more scoped. Do we have like a sufficient, like what's the precedent here for a new concept? Like totally new orthogonal concept that ties in? Like how do we balance that kind of trade-off as a group? Because that's a hard justification to go to a new top level concept without a lot of prep work. Is there more stuff than I'm seeing here where people think there's a lot of use cases that are captured by tags? It's kind of just I didn't see a lot of depth in it.
Yeah, that's a good question. Like it doesn't, I guess I hope to have a decent discussion here, but we probably just need a lot more work in defining what the use cases are and why any one of these solutions may be better than the other. I mean, I think that my understanding is, like Jordan said, it's about who's writing it. it's not a selection use case as much as it is a policy use case, in that every you're evaluating the resources against the policies, and so you're looking at every resource anyway, or as opposed to selecting resources using these. Now, labels obviously are selectors, and that's the primary use, I would say. The tags would have a different set of they would be set by administrators as opposed to by the people creating the objects themselves. So it sounds like what Daniel was, well, I'm not sure if it was Daniel or Jordan. Somebody suggested you'd create this tag and then you would apply the tag on the creation of the object or something. So it's almost like a preset or something of tags. Is that what's being proposed? It's not real clear to me.
Yeah, I think we haven't had like an actual proposal, so it's a little bit hard to discuss like what the proposal is.
Okay, then maybe well, finish what you're saying.
No, that's all I was going to say.
I was going to say maybe what we should do coming out of this is get general feedback on, of these three approaches, do we feel the need to flesh out more than one of them? Do we think, is anybody really interested in number one or number two or number three? And maybe we can start to just take that as guidance as to which ones need to be fleshed out more, rather than, since it seems like nobody, I'm not hearing any really deep feedback yet because there's very ill-defined.
So I don't know if this...
From my perspective, I guess the thing that would be useful in this group is to decide if, or at least collect like user data, like how much need is there for these things, like any of them, because it would be kind of disruptive and a little risky to implement without breaking existing clients. I think that's would be my primary concern with any of these. And I think the actual work for implementing these things would be coming from mostly SIG auth and SIG API machinery. So I think we would need to get those SIGs to like actively sign up for this. I'm not personally excited about any of the things on this list, but I a sufficient horde of users would probably convince me.
I wanted to draw an analogy here to the challenges we've had with working group multi-tenancy and finding like implementing things that aren't just mechanical transformations, right? So namespace selector, like some of the work Huawei did where they created an entirely different virtualized control plane. Some of the other elements, we really just have a couple of hammers and we're using them the same way. One of the best arguments for a new mechanism is that it allows, whether it's like, say like there's a new scope, we only have cluster and namespace, like a new scope that's truly orthogonal, or the idea that namespace, like the whole point of that is to free up and allow some of these problems to get solved. Would we as a group be skeptical of something that like, we talked about user feedback from things like SIG multi-tenancy or the working group multi-tenancy that said, which of the approaches there even benefit from some of these things or not? And is that an appropriate test? Because I see a struggle to cross policy, like we've delegated a lot to policy and that's successful. Webhooks kick the problem down the can and we have RBAC and we've done just a tiny set of tweaks around it. We have not added a new fundamental concept in 5 years. I'm not saying that's a reason not to add a new one. What's the bar?
Yeah, I think gathering the use cases that we're currently using selectors for and currently wrestling with sort of these chicken egg, like all or nothing. The only way we can choose what the policy is with the selector, but then if you can edit it, then you can influence whether it falls under the policy or not. Like some of the extension points we have today, we just have to say like, you can't let someone edit a namespace labels if you want to decide whether their thing falls under policy, or you can't use object level selectors because it for policy security related webhooks. So that's a pretty big caveat to the current.
I mean,
dependencies.
yeah, we
Like-
definitely don't support that stuff out of the box, but I really think if you were motivated enough, you could build it with webhooks and separately storing things.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify something on the first option here, which is the metadata policy. I don't think it was clear from the doc. So I don't think that the existing metadata policy proposal that's there, anyone thinks that's a good idea at this point. The idea here was more that, building something like metadata policy or just label policy, if we want to keep it simple, as a kind of built-in admission controller. I agree with you, Daniel, that it would be pretty straightforward to implement this as a webhook, but there are some challenges with webhook admission from a security perspective, and this feels like kind of a fundamental enough use case that this might be one of the few policies that actually makes sense to be built in as a kind of core policy type.
I mean, even if we want to build something and adopt it in core, I'd still prefer to see it built separately first.
Agreed.
You may not want to use a admission webhook. You might want to use the auth-z webhook to do some of the implementation, or a combination of both. But yeah, I also think a separate implementation would demonstrate that the concept is sound and that it has users.
And I think one of the concerns with putting constraints with reusing labels and then trying to ACL individual keys on labels is clients that don't necessarily properly handle merging those patching those labels, and therefore try to put a label, and what happens for them? Does the whole put get rejected? So we can be strict and say, well, they're just broken clients, but that seems dangerous.
Yeah, no, I even in cases where I'd really like to break clients that are doing bad things, like putting in duplicate owner references, as we talked about yesterday in API machinery, we're coming down pretty heavily on the side of not actually breaking clients.
Clayton, to your question about what is different or new about this, I think the idea that it's policy oriented and therefore there's an expectation that there's ACL around it and it's trustworthy. Labels were super useful and the horse sort of got let out of the barn, and then later we're like, oh, maybe we could use this for policy things. And you sort of you can claw your way back if you put enough after the fact controls and you're super careful and but it's unexpected and it's inconsistent between systems. So on some systems, namespace labels are totally unprotected and anyone can set anything. And then in other systems, there's all this webhook, OPA, gatekeeper mechanism stuff around it. I think identifying the use cases and then thinking about are those possible to address with the existing mechanisms, or would it be either too inconsistent or too difficult to use to try to bolt it on top?
Yeah, and we've never done a two-way, so an example here would be with persistent volume claims, we went through the whole thing about how do you move a persistent volume from one namespace to another if you weren't editor in both namespaces and you can't fiddle with persistent volumes. We basically punted and said admins, but there's kind of this is the standard, you offer something up and someone has to accept it. I would like to see some discussion about labels. Is there a difference between labels as you declare them and labels as you are allowed to be selected on by them, which is not really any of these, but is another dimension. We talked about this with RBAC for, I don't know, we talked about it a couple of years ago. And it was just if you have to have permission to be queryable or selectable, distinct from the permission to set it, does that change some of the the calculations here for things like labels. If there's two sides to a label, for instance, would be a different approach.
Yeah, I mean, if annotations are just a bucket for things to attach data to, labels are for selection, and tags are for admin, policy, auditability, like hierarchy, like things the system is expressing about the object. I can squint and sort of see those categories. I do have questions about whether the existing mechanisms that let you use selectors, like, are we also going to have like tag selector?
To go even further, like, there's people who use labels and annotations interchangeably until they realize the limitations on labels, and then they switch to an annotation. We know that there's a vast majority of things out there that are using annotations and labels for policy already. A new thing that would it have to be a superset of the things that you use labels and annotations for? That's what makes me a little squinty about tags is, you know, if I want to do policy on your ability to set attach data on an object, like attach data is a generic concept, selection is a generic concept. If we add a new generic concept, it doesn't allow me to control those previous two, right? Like tags wouldn't let me carry label values and do selection. Tags wouldn't let me have extended JSON descriptions of attached data. Now, maybe it is informational, which would probably be the counter argument, but I just struggled with that particular angle. So nobody really has something they want that's generic. We have a bunch of individual things we want. Is the best way to come up with a generic concept to try and make the biggest possible orthogonal change? Or is it to say design Kubernetes 2.0 and good luck next time, we've learned better from this? Like, we've had that discussion before.
Yeah, I think the crisp use cases would be helpful. So like the things expressed in the thread around hierarchy. Right now, there's not an expectation of hierarchy on labels. Like even the built-in objects are inconsistent about, you know, do the labels of the parent get propagated to the child? Generally, they don't. So hierarchy is one, and the ability to have policy apply to objects and not have to basically reinvent the wheel with your own gatekeeper stuff to keep the thing that's selecting the object safe.
So I'm going to suggest. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead, John.
I was just going to say, I'm going to suggest at this point, I don't think there's a lot new coming out of this conversation. So let's be respectful of everybody's time and say that those people who are keen on this concept put together some really crisp use cases, maybe start a cap, and we don't have to know what the solution is yet. It could be any of these, but let's enumerate the use cases so that we can start to evaluate the solutions realistically.
Yeah, I have one additional thought, which is the magnitude of like how much work this is. I would say this is at least half as big as server-side apply. So it's not really enough just to have use cases. Like we also need probably a team of dedicated people who are excited about making this happen, which might be a high bar. So yeah, that's all I got.
All right. Any objections to that plan? Tim Auclair, do you have enough enthusiasm about this to start that process, or do we need to find another volunteer or volunteers?
I can work on finding those other volunteers and delegating.
Okay, sounds good. All right, excellent. Thank you, everybody. So why don't we move on then? A couple other things on the agenda. We have just sub-project readouts from API review and code.org. Jordan.
Yeah, I linked a couple notable API reviews that recently happened. Dual Stack continues to astonish and amaze and break ground on new API pattern. So this, the one I linked there was actually fixing an issue that's existed for a long time, where if someone submitted a service and left some fields unset, we would helpfully auto-generate values for those fields, ports, node ports, and things like that. And then if they later changed the service type so that node ports were not applicable, we would fail their update. So, and complain about a field that they never set being set. So Tim took a stab at doing sort of a manual version of discriminated union auto clearing. So this first one was pretty manual, but it is setting a pattern, a precedent that we probably will look to make more automatic for discriminated unions in the future. So Antoine had done some work around what that might look like, but it hadn't been implemented yet. So this might be an early manual version of that. So if you're interested, take a look. And then the second thing I linked was a proposal for declarative defaults. This is a way to indicate in the Go type of an API what the default is for a field. And this will bubble into things like Cube Builder and bubble into the custom resource schemas that get generated, and inform the keys that are used for individual items in a list for things like a port, where the port type might default to TCP, and previously that would cause issues. Apply would get confused, or things figuring out duplicates would get confused. So this is adding more information to our schemas so that things that need to understand what the default value for the field is can do the right thing.
Can I add to that? I read Antoine's stuff. I'm hopeful that we can use that to delete a lot of the open-coded defaults that exist around the system, so that what's left in the various defaults.go files are really special cases.
Yeah, I'd like to see that happen. Yeah.
Yeah, that's going to be super awesome.
We have a lot of special cases, but yes, the non-special cases I would like to see collapse to this.
Well, and then we'll make those declarative too. But don't tell Antoine yet.
I saw your proposal to put JSON function calls or JavaScript function calls into. It's not declarative. It's a function call. It's not declarative.
I'm
not excited about the.
Don't ruin it. Foot in the door. Foot in the door.
Was Dims on, or should I talk to code organization as well?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm here. I was just lurking for the first half. So a couple of good news. One is the kubectl stuff is mostly out in staging. I think the CMD kubectl is still in the main where it was before, just because we need to figure out packaging and release strategies for next, in 121, I guess. But it's buildable without pulling stuff from the usual Kubernetes stuff. Cloud Controller Manager is also doing really well. If Walter wants to chime in there.
I don't think.
Sorry, I had to find the unmute button. Yeah, we're trying to get to the point where we don't have to. The individual cloud providers don't have to fork the code, and where it doesn't make any use of any Kubernetes private methods. So I'm hoping that we will be there completely in this coming release. And then we're going to try and unify the CCM and the Kube Controller Manager in the next release, so that we don't have any duplicate code.
Awesome.
I just wanted to call out Walter and CC have done a really good job thinking about how people are going to consume this as well. Like the normal use case of, I want to start with the stock Cloud Controller Manager and then like replace one of the controller loops. They had like prototypes and things that make that pretty low maintenance. So that was great to see.
Then the next one was something We were trying to upgrade to newer version of Go Open API, and Stefan noticed that it was changing our contracts a little bit. So we went back to an old idea. Jordan, you might want to speak to this about pulling stuff out from the Go Open API repository.
Yeah, so the Go Open API library is pretty sprawling, and it just has a different goal than we do. So its goal is to expand more and more and encompass more and more and address more and more Open API focused use cases. And our goal is to have a stable subset that is as expressive as we need it to be for Kubernetes types, but doesn't sort of introduce new syntax or new mechanisms or new performance issues in an uncontrolled way. And so Stefan identified the subset that we use and pulled that out so that we can fix performance issues there, or make changes that improve what we surface to users when they hit validation errors on their custom types, things that are oriented towards Kubernetes use of that library. So it significantly reduced the amount of code that we were depending on, and I'm very hopeful that it will be it'll support our uses better in the future.
Right. So the main thing to note here is it's a perma fork. So, but if we see a problem, we'll go look in upstream Go Open API and copy over the changes if needed. Other than that, we are not going to do any syncs. That was the main implication here.
And just for reference, there have really only been 2 changes that I'm aware of that we needed to update Go Open API to pick up. And both of those were ones we identified and drove upstream. And most of the other changes we've brought in have been ones that we needed to either work around or prevent from influencing our API in ways we didn't want.
Right. So after the reason why we ended up trying to do this, we kind of rushed into it also was because somebody was wanting the value to print out the value in an error message that was coming out. So that got patched also after the fork. So we are all set there. So the next one is something that spanned SIG scheduler and SIG node. And basically the idea was there's a new API that related to node that needs to be used in the scheduler. So the problem here was we needed, usually we try to move stuff from KK into staging, but here we are introducing a new staging repository right from the get-go. And the reason for doing this is because the code in there needs to be used by both kubelet and scheduler, and it needs to be available for use outside as well. So there were multiple angles to this. So there were a couple of KEPs that got updated, and there was discussion on the SIG node and SIG scheduler mailing list. And there was discussion in SIG node meeting as well, and we ended up going down this route. So please take a look if you have any concerns about that. Then the last 2 were just dependency updates. One was the Cobra one, which we dealt with the last couple of days. And the Containerd C Advisor Docker is still in progress. There's a few problems around this, but we'll deal with it in the PR review. The main problem was x/sys. We'll end up needing an update to that because we ended up reverting x-sys last week because we found another problem just compiling the code in Mac OS. So there is some problem with our verified dependencies. So I have to go look at that and make sure that we fix that before we let this PR in. So that's all I had. Yes, Daniel, we'll be very rich.
Of all the things for me to be remembered by in the
All right, great. Well, thank you, everybody. That's it for our agenda. So we can get back 20 minutes, and we'll see you all in a couple of weeks. I hope to get some more details on this proposal. So thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
See ya.